Hello, Conscious Capitalist listeners. We're pressing pause on our regular episodes for a special summer series. As a part of our summer takeover of the podcast, we'll be exploring the future of the conscious enterprise and dissecting what it will take for businesses to thrive in a world of radical uncertainty. We'll also dive into how conscious capitalism can build more agile, innovative, and resilient companies, and how leaders can reinvent their mindsets. If that sounds like something you need right now or interested in exploring, don't forget to join us. And if the series would be of interest to other CEOs, colleagues, or friends, send them to Apple or Spotify. And joining me today as my co-host is someone who brings both heart and rigor to the conversation on conscious capitalism and conscious leadership, Kate Adams. Kate works with myself and the rest of the Conscious Capitalism team in leading our thought leadership and impact work. She spent her career at the intersection of purpose and performance. She's led purpose-driven organizations in the UK and also advised FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies on the people side of driving business performance. She served on several boards, including her current role with Paralympics in Great Britain. And as a result of that, she has all this wonderful regalia from the Paralympics in Paris, etc., where her commitment to human potential really shines through. Kate, it's great to have you with me today and great to have you as part of our team.
Thanks, Timothy.
Today, we want to welcome a special guest who will lead to a fascinating discussion that relates to why we believe conscious capitalism is more important now than ever. Today, we have Michele Zanini, who's a global expert on management innovation. He's the co-author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Humanocracy. And to celebrate its 5th year, they've got a new version that comes out next week on August 26th. Now, the book advocates for a radical transformation of organizational models, and he argues that traditional bureaucratic structures are a major liability in today's fast-paced world, stifling innovation, adaptability, and human potential. So with that, Michele, welcome.
Thank you so much, Timothy and Kate. It's lovely to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have a dialogue on these issues.
So I think that this was a groundbreaking book when it came out in 2020, and I think it's fantastic that you've done the 2nd edition with lots of new material. It's only been 5 years, but boy, the world has gone by pretty quickly in that period. And what I find fascinating is that in this period of radical uncertainty, and a time when, whether it's geopolitical uncertainty or the uncertainty around AI and quantum computing, biotechnology, robotics, nanotechnology, massive disruption coming to our business models. And you make the case that now more than ever, human-based organizations are going to be more important. So tell us a little bit about the case for humanocracy, humans being more important.
The general observation is that, as you mentioned, Timothy, we are now as a species confronting a host of opportunities and challenges that are unprecedented. And tackling these challenges will require organizations that are truly capable, that are daring, that are able to kind of be animated by a bold, pioneering spirit, that are resilient, they're able to pivot as circumstances change, that are creative and entrepreneurial, they're catalysts for game-changing innovation, and that are also very inspiring. They're capable of amplifying human initiative and ingenuity. And these characteristics, daring, resilient, creative, and inspiring, they are very human characteristics. It's what defines us as a species at our best. Right? We're not always like this, but at our best we are, right? In our personal lives, certainly we can find instances when we display those qualities. And the argument we make in the book is that these features, these characteristics of human beings at their best are not really harnessed and developed in most organizations. And so you end up with organizations that are less capable than the people inside them. And it's, not necessarily deliberate, like if people are going to work, executives saying, let's find ways to kind of crush the human spirit today. Let's be really efficient in that. So that's kind of their operating system. That's what it's kind of selecting for and how it's kind of structured. And it's a vestige of the industrial era of the late kind of 19th century when, control and conformance were like really, really important. I mean, they still are today, but at the time they were like the foundational capabilities. And they're still important today, but we need more, right? We need some of those other things that I mentioned earlier. So that's in essence the case.
Well, I like the idea that in essence, at a time when we have things like AI coming in, and nobody quite knows what the ultimate impact will be, yet at the same time, in many industries, and I'll take banking as an example, every bank will have an AI application for your mortgaging, and everybody will have it. And it may be a transition to how we get there, but eventually it will be commoditized from a process point of view. So the differentiator in those organizations isn't going to lie that you've got a incremental advantage on AI. It's going to lie in the people, their ability to be resilient, their ability to be innovative, and to unleash. Paradoxically, in a time of AI technology, we need to unleash that capability more than ever if you really want to build a competitive advantage that lasts. And I love that you start to point out in the book that there are models of how that kind of radical innovation can occur at the front end. And I mean, one of my favorite examples is Hire in China that many people will not have heard of. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about why you think they're an exemplar.
We got to know them when Zhang Rumin, who is now the emeritus chairman, but at the time he was running the company, visited Gary Hamel and me. Gary Hamel is a longtime partner of mine, co-author of Humanocracy. He had written a book called Future of Management in 2008. Zhang Rumin read it and came to visit. And incidentally, maybe a story I can tell you later, but we ended up visiting Zhang Rumin and I and his team a Whole Foods store on Columbus Circle, New York, because Zhang Rumin was really interested in understanding how Whole Foods worked at the time. So he's a very curious and creative person when it comes to management practices. And he came with this idea, which we thought was kind of nuts, partly because we didn't speak Chinese, so this is all kind of translated, and we were quite sure what he was saying. But his idea was, I want to create a company where everybody feels like they're like a CEO, where they have the ability, they have the tools, the incentives, and the structures to create value for their customers in a way they report to the customer, they don't report to a supervisor. That's where the control comes from this kind of marketplace dynamic. And so he ended up developing this kind of management model that is just incredible. It's the term for it is Rindan Hoi, which basically is a mashup of Chinese characters that means basically users and employees creating value together, right? And so the goal of the company is to create zero distance between itself and the customer, and everybody is kind of reporting to a customer, as I mentioned earlier. And they started in a very humble way. They were like a municipally owned refrigerator company in this kind of tier 2 city in China, but now they're the largest appliance maker in the world. They employ about 84,000 people. About 60,000 of them are in China. They own GE appliances in the US. And we can come maybe talk a little bit about how their model is applied to GE appliances. So they're like a really, really large company. They're incredibly innovative in the industry, and they have like a great performance track record. But maybe the more remarkable thing is sort of how their model works. And if you want, I can kind of give you
give us an overview of that. I think that's important.
Yeah,
zero distance to the customer. I love that phrase.
Right.
Zero distance to the customer.
Yeah, and everybody their CEO. And again, he's a bit of a philosopher, so he even would cite to you, which is kind of why he's a very values-driven individual, and this value and this ethos kind of permeates the model. But he basically cites the categorical imperative and says, people are not instruments. They're like, they have intrinsic value, and it should be the organization that is just the instrument that people use, right? So it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. But that kind of worldview leads to an organization that is incredibly flat. So let's take China. So about 60,000 people. They have like 2 layers of management between the frontline teams and the CEO. So this is like a huge company with minimal levels of hierarchy, where the work gets done by micro enterprises. These are little mini businesses that have a clear line of sight to the customer, and each has P&L accountability. Now, some of these are customer facing. Others instead are more like support micro enterprises. They care of a function like design of components or manufacturing, and even staff functions such as HR, finance. They all kind of work in this like disaggregated model. And the way they come together, because they're not all independently operating, they have to combine forces to bring a product to market, is they do that through a web of contracts. So let's say that you are the team charged with a new refrigerator, putting it into the market. So you would tap into an internal marketplace where you put out a bid and say, hey, I want to put this kind of refrigerator into the marketplace with these kinds of specs. And then you start getting proposals from different factories, from different design units, from different service units. And by the way, if you don't deliver on your promise, you get docked for that, or you might get replaced by another unit, right? And this is true, as I said, even for support functions. So, I've met a lot of HR leaders who would tell me, well, we're very customer focused, but my question is, can they fire you? Can the customer fire you as the HR department? And the answer is no. Well, then you're if you're like the internal monopoly, you don't necessarily have the same level of focus on delivering value and adding value at all times. And there's not this kind of sense of real accountability that there is in this kind of internal marketplace. Anyway, so that's one, and we can go deeper if you want. And there are ways in which this sounds kind of crazy and unmanageable, but they've worked hard over time to make sure these contractual relationships are actually easy to enter into, and make sure that everybody who's part of these web of contracts is focused not only on their little unit, but on the whole. But it's basically this model is one where you basically have an internal marketplace, and everybody is working with a group of 10, 15 people, and they feel like that's their business. They're working with it's literally like a collection of startups in a large company.
How does that play out in terms of the overall competitive advantage and performance of the organization?
Yeah, well, so one thing that Hire is able to do is move incredibly fast, because, no one needs to be given permission to try something new. So there's a group of 30-something engineers and marketing people who, this is about 10 years ago, who saw this trend of e-gaming, this idea that people would, spend a lot of money to play games, and sometimes competitively. And Hire did not really have, they produced laptops, in addition to appliances, but they didn't have any like high-end gaming computers. And so these young employees basically said, we're going to create our own business. And I remember the head of the laptop division told me, well, I thought it was a crazy idea, but like who am I to stop them? Like if the customer wants this kind of stuff, they should try. And so they gave them a little bit of experimental capital, and then they started negotiating with internal parts of Hire and the outside as well, because they didn't have everything they needed to put these kinds of computers together. And now, that little business became its own entity. Hire owns part of it, but essentially IPO'd. And it's the largest kind of not only provider of gaming hardware in China, but they also have all kinds of services attached to it, like gaming hotels, where literally you just go with your friends for a weekend and all you do is play games, and you get, I don't know, it's kind of hard for me to fathom that. But they branched out into all kinds of crazy things. And again, that's just kind of a little example, but you can see that repeated at scale every day. And there's another business around laundromats in colleges that became a really big thing. And again, no one, the CEO of Hire did not sign that off. They probably would never have imagined it. But so they're incredibly nimble. So I would say that's the biggest advantage. They can just move, and they can kind of, the other thing that this allows them to do is to be very fluid in terms of attracting resources, not only internally, but externally. So they worked a lot with external providers and bringing them into what they call an ecosystem. And in fact, they're kind of measured on that. They're not measured these micro enterprises and only on are you generating revenue or are you adding margin, but rather are you bringing in a whole like ecosystem of services around products. And so that's in I think what their biggest advantage is, Kate, from their model.
Thank you. And I'm just thinking, how does this translate in organizations that aren't so product focused? Does it work there too?
I can give you another example. We can kind of move from China to the Netherlands if you want. And I'll give you, this is a nonprofit example. And again, these models are not quite the same in terms of the practices, but they are, I think, quite similar in terms of the principles. So like a lot of what you need to do when you look at these organizations is not emulate what they do, but like understand how they think, right? So this other example comes, I said, from the Netherlands. It's a company called Buurtzorg. I don't know if Timothy or Kate, you've heard of it.
Yeah.
They were started again by a very inspired individual, Jos de Blok, who was a nurse in the public health system. So each team has about a territory that encompasses 10,000 people. And they are responsible for taking clients, for renting space, for recruiting, for budgeting, for scheduling, for constantly improving the quality and efficiency of their care. So each nurse plays some sort of like administrative managerial role. So someone is sort of the treasurer, someone is like monitoring performance, someone is doing the planning, someone is developing people, and others are mentoring, typically the kind of more tenured nurses. And so these are typically roles that are played in other organizations by managers. But the interesting thing about Buurtzorg is that everybody in a way is a manager, right? Which is why you end up with an organization a bit like Hire that is very large, not as large as Hire, but so you're talking 10,000 people, and there are 0 layers between these teams and the director, who now is, Jos is now again kind of retired or emeritus, but the director of Buurtzorg, all these teams nominally report to that person, right? So that's it, and they have an incredibly the lean structure where, aside from these people in the teams distributed across the territory, there are about 100 people at headquarters. 50 are like coaches, and they're really coaches. Like the teams don't report to them, but they're resources the teams can use in case they get stuck. And then 50 people that do back office, HR, finance. That's it. It's like incredibly lean. And you might think this is kind of a recipe for idiosyncrasy and waste and repetition, but if you look at the statistics, they are by far the best performing healthcare provider in the Netherlands in terms of client satisfaction, in terms of hours per client, days in care per client, hospital admissions. They're all lower by significant margin from the rest. And so much so that now, like, basically their model has been taken up by other home health services providers. It's kind of the norm in the Netherlands now. So they went from this kind of bureaucratic, top-down, managerialist way of approaching care for people at home to the Buurtzorg model. So it's an amazing story. And so, again, you couldn't go farther from Hire than Buurtzorg, but in a way, some of the essence, I think, and some of the principles are kind of comparable.
How do you have that discussion with CEOs to help have them do a mindset shift? That I'm used to this top-down hierarchical control, and now we want you to think about this differently. Whether you call it freedom within a framework or zero distance to the customer, it's a radical shift in management philosophy and, more importantly, management practice. And how do you, when you come up against this, how do you have that dialogue about shifting mindsets?
One of the things that they have is like a very strong purpose. There's this basically deep commitment to professional values, the professional ethic of a nurse, and the patient as sort of the center of everything, right? And so their motto is like humanity over bureaucracy. That's actually their slogan. And it's kind of the glue that connects all teams, right, around a shared objective. I mean, they actually see themselves as a freedom movement in healthcare. So that's like super important. It's sort of as a way, it's a North Star. Yeah, they're freedom fighters, and they're all kind of fighting the same mission. And so even if there may be differences between the teams, it's something you can come back to, right, as a unifying force. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they have real accountability. So, performance data across all these teams is visible across the network, and there's no place to hide, and you're expected to deliver. You're expected to perform at a certain level. I mean, this is not, money isn't infinite. You need to be utilized a certain amount, right? And if you don't, then something will happen. And sometimes teams get shut down if they're dysfunctional, and they get so it's not like. Yes, it's a supportive culture, but you also need to perform, and performance is visible to everyone. And then, there's skills, you need to be able to exercise self-management judiciously. So everybody's trained on how to make decisions independently, how to give each other feedback in a particular way, how to deal with thorny problems in a way that depersonalizes the conflict so that things don't go off the rails. And then they also have a very sophisticated information system that allows nurses to find out who's an expert on a particular topic, even beyond their team, or organize or try to tackle common challenges, so that the network as operates more than just kind of some of the parts. That there are ways to create best practices and have them propagate across the organization, but it's done through kind of horizontal mechanisms, right? So anyway, so those are the kinds of things you would need to have in place. Because otherwise, it's easy to decentralize, it's easy to flatten, but then you might end up with a lot of repetition, a lot of idiosyncrasy. And so so you need to be quite deliberate, I think, in sort of architecting these kinds of things.
What I think you touched on there, Michele, is really important that, in a sense, they're a tech company that enables people to be at their best. Because when I've been slightly involved with them over in the UK, what became clear was how important that technical background was. The technology, that ability to have real-time data on quality and performance and expert networks, and AI is going to accelerate all of that.
Exactly.
But their competitive advantage of that client interface is going to, it's going to be an infinite competitive advantage for them in that sense, because they've got that people thing down, and the technology is an enabler of the people to do their best in servicing other people. So I think that that's a brilliant case and a really good example of how the combination of technology and people can really make a difference.
And really important that you can't have the freedom without the framework. Because I imagine people think the freedom is easier to think about than the framework. And actually, you mustn't kind of plunge for the freedom without the framework being in place. But I'm really interested in Timothy's question about the mindset shift, because I think this is a big step from traditional MBA training, leadership training. What are your thoughts on how you shift into that mindset?
The alternative we lay out is, definitely practical, but it's could be quite daunting, right? Especially if you're not facing like near death or experience or big crisis. One of the pushbacks I sometimes get is that, the companies like Hire or companies like Buurtzorg, and there are many others. And, one other one that, if you're interested in services, is Handelsbanken, which is a Nordic bank that operates in the UK. They have a very similar system of decentralization, very few layers, and a lot of information systems that allow people to make sophisticated decisions to the front line. But anyway, so examples like this are examples that, either were forged out of a crisis and a new CEO came and kind of did Control-Delete, but they had to because otherwise the alternative was going to be like extinction, or they're like Lady Gaga, they're kind of born that way. I'll maybe give you some general kind of observations, and maybe I can kind of give you another case, just another example to make this tangible. But I think you basically have to realize that, the playbook that you've been using for the last 20, 30 years isn't just going to work anymore. Whether it's acquiring other companies or getting regulatory relief or counting on government stimulus that juices up demand, or, legislation that lowers interest, your tax rate, or the, loose monetary policy. All those things, by the way, have conspired. They've conspired to cement the status quo. They've been very helpful in kind of giving companies the room to operate without making these big changes. But in a way, like, those things are coming to an end, and so time is now to the time is to get serious, and you just have to realize that the playbook doesn't work, and whoever masters a new playbook will probably get an advantage. That'd be number one. Number two would be to say, a lot of the control that you think you have, you really don't. It's it's almost like an illusion, or you have to work so hard to exercise control, because if everything depends on you being the controller in chief, even if you're like incredibly smart and work really hard, if you're like working in a large company, there isn't enough time in the day for you to process everything. So it's much better, and even personally, even from a mental health perspective, better for you to create a system where control happens in other ways without you having to be in charge at all times. And then the third thing I would say is that even though, Hire and Buurtzorg might look like, completely different species from yours, even those organizations kind of evolved over time. And so you can be revolutionary in your goals, but you can be very kind of, evolutionary in the way you get there, right? And so it's through experimentation and iteration. And so, even astronauts, when they go on to the International Space Station, and get on launched by the rocket, they start the day by putting, their pants one leg at a time, right? So you can kind of like break down the problem and start small, and then work to become more ambitious over time. So I think it's just basically saying, those would be that would be my kind of my pitch. You got to come up with different ways of creating value. You got to create a way to give you way more leverage than you have right now. And then the third thing is like, you can get there. It's, you can do it, and you can be judicious. You don't have to blow everything up.
That's really interesting. And I'm thinking as we go into the future, so, you've described some companies, how they operate today. And we're also really interested in thinking about how companies operate tomorrow and how they survive the disruption that's happening, the radical uncertainty that's happening. How do these kind of models build resilience?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that they help you build resilience is that they, if you think about like the problem with the traditional model is that change happens when basically the CEO or the people at the top of the organization says change needs to happen. By the time that decision is made, it's often too late. Because often the CEOs and the top suite, top C-suite is kind of the last to know. They are in a way insulated from reality by layers of managers who don't necessarily want to bring the bad news. They operate in their own, frame of, and assumptions about the industry that they developed as they became senior, which might have worked 20 years ago, but maybe the industry has changed, and and everybody's kind of like that, and so there's a bit of an echo chamber, and so like if you often the bottleneck is at the top of the bottle, right? So by the time an issue is big enough that it requires CEO attention for you to respond and create resilience, it's like so the model where decision making and leadership is more distributed allows you to sort of see the problem and respond much more quickly, which allows you then to become more adaptable. And it gives people permission to respond and try things much more quickly. Which doesn't mean that, again, it's like everybody can do whatever they want. It needs to be coherent, it needs to be within a strategic frame, but it allows you, it ensures the organization isn't kind of held hostage to the willingness of the people at the top to kind of to write off their depreciating intellectual capital or experience. So maybe it's kind of a negative way of looking at it, but it's in a way, like, you can be incredibly capable as a CEO, but like, honestly, can you really figure everything out on your own? Right? It's just, to me, it's not realistic, and it's not a good way to bet. Yeah, you might get an unbelievably effective CEO who can make all those decisions, but chances are, that's pretty rare.
I'm really interested in the how-to, and in your new book, you've got a whole chapter on Roche, and because we've talked about two companies who were Lady Gaga's, right? They were sort of brought up and born that way, but Roche had to develop that way. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about what were a couple of the critical things that you think Roche did to start going on this journey?
Let me give you maybe the kind of short summary of Roche, which I think is a very instructive case of how you work to cure some of the ills that I mentioned earlier that might work against resilience, and then increasing competition from biotechs, right? And so Severin Schwan, who was the CEO at the time, basically said, we need to be far more agile than we are right now. And I think other people in the top team would kind of share that concern, but they maybe were not that serious about it, or didn't share the sense of urgency that Severin had. So what he did with Tammy Lowry, who was chief talent officer at the time, was basically kind of orchestrate a awareness raising session for senior leaders. And this is like a 4-day program they called Kinesis, and it proved to be incredibly transformative. So I'll just give you some of the key highlights, right? So one thing they did before the event began was participants had to complete a comprehensive assessment for themselves and their peers. And so they evaluated 29 leadership traits, things like, am I caring? Do I collaborate? Am I arrogant, autocratic? Am I driven? Am I ambitious? Do I have, think about problems in systems ways, or what is my IQ? So there's a whole group of traits, but they basically clustered it in 2 dimensions. One is reactive versus creative, and the other one was task versus kind of relationship. These kind of 2 axes, and then they basically put like a little circle with all these traits along these 2 axes, and they asked people, given your dominant traits, like to put themselves in the right place in the circle, and most of them went in the kind of quadrant of the circle that was like task and reactive. And basically, task and control orientations are good things in a way. You need some of that, but they don't really scale. Micromanagement doesn't scale. Like if you're managing the global enterprise, this level of top-down control, as I mentioned earlier, isn't very feasible, right? So it's, I think the one analogy was, it's like driving at 100 miles an hour in 3rd gear. Like at some point the transmission fails, right? And so people were working really hard, 60-hour weeks, they felt overwhelmed, right? So they needed to find some sort of other gear, some other method to increase impact per unit of time, right? So that was kind of their shift. They realized we need to go from like command and control to envisioning and enabling, right? And we need to basically change the way we think of our role, right? And so they started role-playing different kinds of ways of leading. And Tammy, I think, talked about leadership being, the definition of leadership shifting from basically a support function. So leaders, not as people who get served, but the people who are actually supporting, who are kind of creating the system for others to add value and thrive. So that's one thing they did. The other thing they did is they looked at some of the companies we talked about earlier, just to open their minds and understand, there are alternatives, right? And so at the end of the workshop, it was a big wake-up moment. They basically, kind of concluded, hey, the status quo is kind of indefensible. There are alternatives, and we have to do something. At the time, there wasn't like some top-down edict that every person that attended the workshop would need to do X, Y, and B, and Z, and follow a playbook. But they were kind of told, encouraged to try something in your unit. And one of the people that really took this to heart was Bill Anderson, kind of the protagonist of our story, who at the time was running Genentech. He ended up running Roche Pharma as well, right? And so what he did something similar with his leadership team, where they reset kind of expectations of what they need to do as leaders. And then he started changing the way the organization worked. So a couple of things he did. And then one of the things he did was he kind of, a little bit like Hire, a little bit like Buurtzorg, said, let's disaggregate the organization into these squads that are empowered to serve patients, and they have all the different functions within them, and they have P&L responsibility, so they don't have to depend on other people to get the job done, right? So he ended up creating these little units as opposed to being very siloed. The other thing he did is that he created like a very dynamic way of allocating resources and budgets. So instead of like one big budget, like multiple budgets that were kind of reset every year, it was one single budget where money, and every 90 days, these teams would come together, review priorities, and decide, hey, who needs more money, who needs less money, given what they're trying to do. So there's a whole visibility around the shared priorities, and there was this collegiality around who should get the money because they needed to do something that benefits not only them but the company as a whole. So they in the book we go in more detail in terms of how this process works. But the impact was amazing, over the course. And by the way, they also did this in the international part of Roche. So this program kind of ended up evolving in different ways, but very consistent, the entire enterprise. And so, at the end of 5 years, I mean, the journey isn't over for them. They keep on evolving and changing. But the results, it's hard to argue with them. In, I think, 2023, which is when our story ended, revenues were a quarter, 25% higher than they were 5 years earlier. ROI was up despite the patent cliff, but despite a lot of their revenue going away, they just replaced it with other things. So kind of a hallmark of resilience and adaptability. And, they had lower headcount, so they were able to do more with less. So, it's just one story. Again, what needs to be learned from here is not so much exactly what they did, but the fact that they were very courageous. They were able to, they were able to look inside and see that they needed something different, and they were able to kind of have the sense of this is a worthwhile problem.
And I took from that the importance of starting with the alignment in the leadership.
Yeah.
Awareness piece, where as a team, let's just have the awareness that there's new expectations, there are alternatives, we can't stay as we are. Now, how are we going to collectively think about the next thing that we do?
The other thing that happened, kind of a complement to that, is that then the work of designing these processes or these structures that I mentioned earlier, like the budgeting system and these teams, was kind of syndicated to the organization. So there were design teams made up of people that were practitioners who basically came up with those kinds of things. And so, the leader can kind of get understand that they need to do something different, they need to play a different role, but then a lot of the work was done in a very distributed way, right? So it's not because you could imagine, the leader saying, okay, I understand we need to architect a new model, let me architect a model for everyone. In their case, it was more like, okay, I need to create a condition where people can then step up and drive these changes. So I think it's both of those things.
I like that condition where I created conditions.
Yeah.
And that's a different kind of model of leadership. It's not like I make decisions. No, I create conditions. Yeah. And this idea that the role of senior leadership is to create the conditions where people can be at their best, where we can, have the biggest impact on our customers and our clients. I think that's so important. And Kate, your point about it began with the leaders at the top, examining themselves and sort of saying, how do I need to change out of this quadrant to be somebody who's a condition creator versus a task reactor? I love it. So, Michele, we really appreciate your time today. You're such a thought leader in this space, and it's inspiring to hear these stories. And we're also really grateful that you'll be joining us in Cincinnati on September 25th to be one of the keynote speakers at our conference on the future of the conscious enterprise. And the theme of that future of the conscious enterprise is, how do you deal with strategy and uncertainty? What are the types of organizational structures we need? And then how, as leaders, do we create caring cultures? And Michele, we're just honored to have you there to talk more about this organization and how these organizations can be created. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Kate and Timothy. This is fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to Cincinnati and being together there for a couple of days.